The blistering sun scorched the dusty roads as Mac Davis climbed out of his battered pickup truck. Standing tall and broad, he was a man who exuded quiet power. His Marine Corps cap sat snugly atop his head, shielding his sharp eyes from the harsh glare. Mac had always been a man of few words but firm actions. His demeanor, calm and composed, often led people to underestimate him, a mistake they only made once. The small town, with its lazy, sun-drenched streets, was supposed to be a refuge, a place where he could leave the chaos of the city behind. Here, Mac planned to start over, far from the noise and trouble that seemed to follow him in urban life. 2 days had passed since he moved into a modest home on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A sanctuary to teach fitness at the local community center and find peace in the simplicity of rural life. The town itself seemed like a relic from another time, with its quaint shops and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed in decades. But as Mac walked toward the diner, something felt off. The subtle glances from the locals lingered a little too long, their curiosity edging into suspicion. These weren't friendly, welcoming looks. They were judgments, thinly veiled beneath polite nods and brief smiles. The diner stood as a testament to a bygone era, its neon open sign flickering weakly against the sun-bleached exterior. The air inside was thick with the smell of grease and stale coffee, a combination that should have been comforting, but instead felt oddly suffocating. Max slid into a booth by the window, appreciating the solitude. The waitress approached hesitantly, her tired eyes scanning him with caution. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of politeness and wariness. "Please," Mac replied, his voice steady and measured. "And whatever special you've got today." She nodded quickly and shuffled away, leaving Mac alone with his thoughts. He adjusted the Marine Corps ring on his finger, a symbol of his service and a reminder of the battles he had already fought. He had no intention of causing trouble or standing out here. All he wanted was peace, a chance to finally breathe after years of living on edge. The bell above the diner door jingled, cutting through the muted buzz of quiet conversations. 3 men entered, their laughter loud and grating. Mac didn't need to look up to know the kind of men they were. He had encountered their type before, arrogant, loud, and searching for dominance in every room they entered. Still, he glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting the leader's smirk. The man, wiry with a swagger that spoke of unearned confidence, locked eyes with Mac before muttering something to his companions. They laughed, their movements calculated as they approached Mac's booth. "Well, look at this," the leader drawled, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "Big guy thinks he owns the place." Mac ignored him, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He had no interest in engaging with their antics. Silence, he had learned, was often the most powerful response, but silence didn't dissuade the trio. The leader leaned in closer, his smirk growing more pronounced. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted. One of the other men, younger and brash, added, "Or maybe he's too busy flexing those big muscles to say hi." Their laughter filled the diner, an ugly sound that made the already tense air feel suffocating. Mac remained composed, his grip tightening slightly on his coffee cup. He had seen this before, men who thrived on intimidation, feeding off the reactions of others. But Mac wasn't like most people. He had been trained to withstand far worse than their petty taunts. The third man, the quietest of the group, leaned against Mac's booth, pretending to inspect his plate. "Not much of a talker, are you?" he said with a smirk. Mac set his cup down, his gaze steady as he finally looked up. His calm demeanor hadn't shifted, but his eyes, hardened by years of discipline and experience, spoke volumes. This wasn't the reaction the men had expected. They wanted fear, anger, or even defiance, something to fuel their bravado, but Mac gave them none of it. Little did they know, they had chosen the wrong man to target. Beneath Mac's quiet exterior lay a resolve forged through years of military service and personal sacrifice. He wasn't a man who sought conflict, but he also wasn't one to back down when challenged. What the trio saw as weakness was, in fact, A strength they could never understand. A strength that would soon shatter their arrogant assumptions. This was supposed to be a fresh start for Mac, a chance to leave the chaos behind. But as the atmosphere in the diner grew heavier with each passing moment, it became clear that trouble had a way of finding him, no matter where he went. And this time, trouble came in the form of three men who had underestimated the wrong Marine. The sun's glare softened against the diner's neon sign as Mac Davis sat calmly in his booth, the fork in his hand methodically cutting into his chicken-fried steak. The stillness was broken by the sharp jingle of the diner's doorbell. Mac glanced up briefly, his eyes instinctively registering the new arrivals. Three men whose raucous laughter reverberated across the room. Their leader, Derek, a wiry figure with an air of cocky arrogance, met Mac's gaze and smirked. Behind him, his two companions, Jake and Evan, followed closely, their synchronized grins as calculated as their leader's swagger. "Would you look at that?" Derek's voice rang out, loud enough to command the room's attention. "Big guy thinks he can just take over our booth." Mac's grip tightened ever so slightly on his coffee cup. His fresh start, it seemed, was off to a rocky beginning. Conversations around the diner fell to a hush as the three men approached. The once vibrant hum of chatter had been replaced by an air of unease, thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek strutted toward Mac with exaggerated steps, his smirk growing wider. Jake and Evan trailed close, their movements echoing his, like shadows feeding off his audacity. They stopped in front of Mac's table, their towering presence casting a literal and figurative shadow over his meal. "Hey, big guy," Derek mocked, leaning casually on the edge of the table. "Didn't know the circus was in town." Mac didn't look up, taking a deliberate sip of his coffee. Years of discipline and training had taught him that silence often carried more weight than words. He refused to take the bait, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Derek's brazen antagonism. "What's the matter?" Jake chimed in, his tone laced with mockery. "Too busy counting calories to say hello?" The laughter that erupted from the trio was loud, grating, and entirely for show. Evan leaned forward, inspecting Mac's plate with exaggerated curiosity. "Man, with all that weight, you must have been first in line when they served breakfast," he sneered. "Or maybe second, third, and fourth." Mac's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he didn't respond. Instead, he calmly continued eating, each movement slow and deliberate, a display of self-control that seemed to irk Derek further. The leader of the pack slapped his hand on the table, the sound reverberating through the now silent diner. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Derek snapped, his frustration evident. Mac set his fork down and raised his eyes to meet Derek's for the first time. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and void of the anger Derek had hoped to provoke. "I didn't realize this was your booth," Mac said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "You want it? Take it. I'm just here to eat." Derek's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he recovered, doubling down on his bravado. "Nah, I'm good standing right here. Gives me a better view of—" he gestured vaguely toward Mac. "Whatever this is." Jake and Evan burst into laughter, their amusement loud and performative. Mac leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest as he met Derek's gaze with unshakable calm. "Are you done?" Mac asked simply. Derek's grin twisted into a sneer. "Done? Oh, not even close. Look at you, big guy. Bet you don't even work. Just sit around all day stuffing your face, huh?" Jake jumped in, adding fuel to the fire. "Probably on disability or something. Milking the system, right?" Mac's fingers curled into a fist beneath the table, but his expression remained neutral. Years of military discipline had taught him to choose his battles wisely, and he wasn't about to let this trio of bullies push him to their level. "Why don't you go sit down and enjoy your lunch?" Mac said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Derek's laughter was harsh and grating. "End? What's that supposed to mean? You threatening me, fat boy?" Jake and Evan stepped closer, their grins shifting into something more sinister. The tension in the diner grew heavier, the air charged with unspoken anticipation. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Mac and the gang, but no one intervened. The waitress had disappeared into the kitchen, leaving Mac alone with the three men. Derek leaned in, his face mere inches from Mac's. "I don't think you get it, Tubby. This is our town. You don't belong here, so why don't you finish your meal? Waddle on out, and never come back." Mac didn't flinch. His voice remained steady, his words deliberate. "I belong wherever I decide to be," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, silence engulfed the diner. Mac's words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Derek's smirk faltered once more, and he took a small step back, seemingly caught off guard by the quiet confidence emanating from the man before him. But the reprieve was short-lived. Jake broke the silence with a derisive snort. "You hear that, Derek? Big guy's got a backbone. Let's see if it can hold up his weight." The laughter returned, louder and more aggressive. Mac glanced at his plate, then back at Derek and his crew, his mind calculating his next move. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the diner was palpable, every patron acutely aware of the confrontation unfolding before them, yet unwilling to intervene. Derek surveyed the room, his smirk returning as he seemed to soak in the silent approval of the onlookers. "You're new around here, aren't you?" he asked, his voice dropping into a more menacing tone. Mac didn't respond immediately. Instead, he calmly met Derek's gaze, his resolve unshaken. The battle of wills had begun, and Mac was ready to show Derek and his gang exactly who they were dealing with. The air inside the diner seemed to grow heavier, as Derek's tone took on a mockingly friendly edge. "See? We don't get many like you in this town," he said, leaning slightly closer. Mac kept his gaze steady, unflinching. "Like me?" he asked, his tone calm but sharpened with an undercurrent of steel. Derek's smirk widened, his eyes slowly scanning Mac from head to toe as though sizing him up. "Yeah, you know, big city types. Real different. You stand out," he chuckled, feigning a sense of camaraderie. "Don't take it the wrong way, though. It's just that people like you don't really fit in around here." Jake crossed his arms and leaned casually against the booth. A smug grin plastered across his face. "He means black," Jake said bluntly. "Don't worry, man. We'll spell it out for you if it's too hard to follow." Evan chimed in with a sneer. "Yeah, folks like you don't last long here. They always seem to pack up and leave real quick. Wonder why that is." The room felt stifling now, their words hanging in the air like a noxious fog. Mac's grip on the edge of the table tightened, his knuckles blanching. He'd heard this kind of rhetoric before. It wasn't about him as an individual, it was about control. Men like Derek thrived on the idea that they owned spaces, deciding who could and couldn't belong. Mac let the silence linger, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You're real brave with three of you and a crowd to back you up," he said at last, his voice low, but cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is this what you do for fun? Push people out because you can't handle the idea of someone different?" Derek's grin darkened into something more sinister. "Nah," he drawled, his voice dripping with malice. "We just like keeping our town clean, you know what I mean? Can't have people like you lowering property values." Jake slapped Derek on the back, laughing loudly. "Derek's doing this town a service. Call him a community leader." Encouraged, Evan pointed a finger at Mac. "Bet you don't even work. You probably came here looking for handouts, disability checks, food stamps, maybe even a little Section 8. Mac clenched his jaw, but he didn't rise to their bait. His calm only seemed to agitate them further, their bravado faltering for a fraction of a second before they doubled down. Men like Derek thrived on chaos. They wanted him to lose control, to lash out, to give them an excuse. But Mac wasn't about to hand them that satisfaction. "You don't know a thing about me," Mac said evenly, his eyes fixed on Derek's. "But keep talking. You're telling me plenty about yourself." For the briefest moment, Derek's smirk faltered before he leaned in again, his voice lowering into a growl. "Oh, we know enough. Guys like you don't belong here. You think you can just show up and what? Pretend you're one of us? Nah, this is our town, our rules. And people who don't like it, they figure it out real quick." Jake nodded, grinning. "Yeah, we make sure of it. Ain't that right, Derek?" "Damn right," Derek said, puffing out his chest. "See, when people like you show up, we remind them they're not welcome. Some get the hint after a few days. Others, well, they need a little more persuasion." For the first time, Mac's calm demeanor cracked, a flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. This wasn't just ignorance or casual bigotry. This was systemic. These men were enforcing an unwritten code designed to intimidate and exclude anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of belonging. "What's the plan?" Mac asked coolly. "You think you're going to scare me into leaving? You're wasting your time." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Man, you don't get it, do you? This isn't a choice. We've been here a long time. You? You're just passing through. It's best you remember that." Derek stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Or maybe you need a little demonstration to make it clearer." The threat was unmistakable, and the tension in the diner reached its peak. Patrons watched in silence, their faces a mix of fear and resignation. No one moved to intervene. Mac slowly stood, his full height dwarfing Derek as he rose from the booth. His broad shoulders and solid frame cut an imposing figure, commanding the room. "You want to make your point?" Mac said, his voice steady and resolute. "Go ahead and try. But I'll warn you now, you won't like the outcome." For a split second, Derek's bravado flickered, but Jake and Evan quickly stepped in, their overconfidence bolstering their leader. Together, they formed a wall of smug arrogance, convinced that their numbers gave them the upper hand. Derek cracked his knuckles, his smirk returning. "Let's see what you've got, fat boy." Mac didn't flinch. His stance was solid, his expression calm, a man ready for what was coming. Derek stepped closer, his tone mocking. "What's the matter, big guy? You scared? Or are you just too slow to do anything about it?" Jake and Evan flanked him, their postures tense but cocky, like predators circling their prey. The diner had fallen deathly silent, the remaining patrons frozen in their seats. The waitress peeked out from behind the counter, her face pale. Mac's voice broke the stillness, cutting through the air with quiet authority. "You boys have made a mistake. You don't want this fight." Derek laughed harshly, the sound bouncing off the diner's tiled walls. "You hear that? Fat boy thinks he's gonna teach us a lesson." He turned to Jake and Evan with a grin. "Maybe we should teach him a little respect first." Jake moved in first, his swing fast but sloppy. Mac sidestepped the blow with ease, twisting his torso to deliver a calculated shove to Jake's chest. Jake staggered backward, crashing into a booth, the plates rattling as he gasped for breath. Mac straightened, his voice calm but firm. "You've got one chance to walk away. Take it." Derek, fueled by humiliation and rage, lunged forward. Derek charged forward with surprising speed, his wild punch aimed squarely at Mac's face. Mac moved instinctively, raising his forearm to block the blow while his free hand shot forward, shoving Derek off balance. The wiry man stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair before managing to catch himself. "You're gonna pay for that," Derek spat, his fists clenching with renewed fury. "Get him!" Evan hesitated, glancing at his leader, but Derek's glare bore down on him like a command. Reluctantly, Evan lunged at Mac, who intercepted him mid-motion. Mac grabbed Evan's arm with precision, twisting it gently yet firmly enough to elicit a yelp of pain. The younger man squirmed, trying to break free, but Mac's grip was unyielding. With a controlled shove, Mac sent Evan sprawling onto the floor. Jake, red-faced and fuming, pushed himself up from where he had crashed into a booth moments earlier. "You think you're tough because you can throw us around?" he snarled. "We'll see how tough you are when we knock you down." Jake and Derek rushed Mac simultaneously, attempting to flank him. Mac pivoted smoothly, ducking under Jake's punch and using the man's own momentum to deliver a calculated strike to his ribs. Jake let out a pained grunt, doubling over and clutching his side. Meanwhile, Derek seized the opportunity to close the gap. He barreled into Mac, slamming his shoulder into the Marine's chest. The impact forced Mac to step back, but failed to knock him down. Sensing an opening, Derek swung again, this time with greater force. Mac caught his arm mid-swing, locking it in place with a firm grip. "You're out of your depth," Mac said evenly, his tone as steady as his resolve. With a sharp twist, Mac forced Derek's arm downward, eliciting a cry of pain from the smaller man. But before Mac could capitalize on his advantage, Evan had scrambled back to his feet and grabbed a chair. With a burst of desperation, he swung it at Mac. The edge of the chair grazed Mac's arm, the fleeting pain sharpening his focus. Mac turned toward Evan, his expression darkening. "That's enough," Mac growled, his voice resonating with quiet authority. Evan froze, his hands still gripping the chair. For a moment, his bravado faltered as his eyes darted toward Derek for reassurance. But Derek, still struggling to free himself from Mac's grip, could only shout through gritted teeth, "Don't just stand there, Evan! Hit him!" Mac released Derek with a shove, sending him stumbling into Jake, who was just beginning to recover. The two men collided, nearly toppling over. Both glared at Mac, their arrogance visibly cracking. Evan, still clutching the chair, took a cautious step back, clearly unsure of his next move. The standoff resumed, the gang circling Mac like wolves regrouping for another strike. Mac stood his ground, his breathing controlled, his stance unwavering. He scanned their faces, noting the growing hesitation in their eyes. "You've already lost," Mac said, his voice calm but cutting. "You just don't know it yet." Derek's fists clenched, his face flushing with frustration. "This isn't over," he snarled, motioning for his crew to spread out again. "You think you can come here, humiliate us, and walk away? Not in our town." Mac's expression remained unchanged. "You've got one more chance," he said, his tone firm and unyielding. "Walk away now, or you'll regret it." The room held its breath, the tension suffocating. A fork clattered to the floor, the faint sound cutting through the silence. Derek's sneer faltered, his resolve wavering under Mac's unshaken confidence, but his pride refused to let him back down. "Get him!" Derek barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his anger. Jake charged first, clumsy but determined. Mac sidestepped effortlessly, using Jake's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby booth. The wooden frame groaned under the impact, and plates clattered to the floor. Before Jake could recover, Mac turned to face Evan, who hesitated again, his fists half raised and his movements unsure. "Don't just stand there, you idiot!" Derek shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. Evan lunged awkwardly, his swing telegraphed and desperate. Mac caught the younger man's arm with practiced precision, twisting it with a fluid motion and redirecting him into the edge of a table. Plates and glasses toppled to the ground as Evan let out a pained yelp, clutching his ribs. Derek's fury boiled over. He charged head-on, his fists flying. Mac blocked the first strike, dodged the second, and stepped in close. With a firm grip, he grabbed Derek by his shirt collar and hoisted him off the ground. The room seemed to hold its breath as Mac slammed Derek against the wall. A framed picture crashed to the floor, shattering on impact, along with Derek's remaining bravado. "You done yet?" Mac asked, his voice low and controlled. The weight of his words pressed on Derek like a vice. Derek squirmed, his eyes darting around the room for support. Jake staggered to his feet, clutching his side, while Evan leaned heavily against a booth, his face pale and uncertain. Both men avoided Derek's gaze, their confidence thoroughly dismantled. "This isn't over," Derek spat, his voice cracking as Mac released him. He stumbled, but managed to stay upright. "We know where to find you." Jake nodded, though his words slurred. "Yeah, you're done. You don't belong here." Evan muttered something unintelligible, his eyes darting between the door and Derek, clearly eager to escape. Derek's trembling hand pointed at Mac, his voice trembling with fury. "You'll regret this. You'll see." Without another word, the trio stumbled toward the door, their retreat clumsy and disorganized. Derek shoved the door open, the bell jingling violently as they disappeared into the street. "We'll make you pay!" Derek shouted over his shoulder, his voice fading as they fled. Mac stood in the center of the wrecked diner, his breathing steady as adrenaline coursed through his veins. He surveyed the damage, the overturned chairs, the shattered glass, the fearful yet relieved faces of the patrons, and sighed deeply. This wasn't the fresh start he had envisioned, but it was a battle he wouldn't shy away from. The fight was over, but Mac knew this was only the beginning. The clatter of shattered chairs and broken plates gave way to a tense silence. The waitress, still pale but with a flicker of admiration in her eyes, peeked out from behind the counter. "Are you okay?" she asked hesitantly, her voice trembling as she took in the scene. "I'm fine," Mac replied, his deep voice calm yet resolute. "Call the police." "I already did," she said, Her words hurried. They're on their way. Moments later, the wail of approaching sirens pierced the lingering tension. 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt outside the diner, red and blue lights flashing through the large glass windows. 2 officers stepped in, their eyes darting from the wreckage to Mac. The taller officer, stocky with a buzz cut, approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What happened here?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional. Mac stood with his arms crossed, his gaze steady as he met the officer's eyes. "I defended myself," he said simply. The waitress stepped forward, her voice hurried and firm. "It wasn't his fault. Those guys, Derek and his friends, they started it. They've been causing trouble around here for years." The officer's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Derek's name, his jaw tightening, though his stance remained guarded. "You're new in town, right?" he asked Mac. Mac nodded. "Just moved here." The officer exchanged a look with his younger partner, who was visibly uncomfortable, his eyes flickering over the wreckage and the patrons' frightened faces. "Derek's known to us," the older officer admitted cautiously, his words measured. "But you seem to have made quite an impression." Mac's jaw tightened, catching the unspoken implication in the officer's tone that he must have done something to provoke the incident. "I didn't start this," Mac said firmly, his voice steady, "but I finished it." The waitress nodded vigorously. "He's telling the truth. Derek and his crew came in, started harassing him, and wouldn't stop. They've done this before, to other people too." The officer sighed, rubbing a hand over his buzzed head. "Yeah, we've had complaints about them before. It's hard to get anything to stick, though." Mac narrowed his eyes. "You're telling me they've been doing this for years, and no one stopped them?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "We do what we can, but people around here don't like to talk. Derek's family has connections. Connections or not, they just threatened me," Mac said, his voice low but sharp. "You planning to do something about that?" The officer hesitated, his posture betraying reluctance. He gestured toward the broken furniture. "We'll file a report. If they come near you again, let us know." Mac's jaw clenched, but he stayed silent. It was clear from the officer's tone that the promise of action was little more than an empty assurance. He'd seen it before, the reluctance of systems to confront the powerful, even when those in power were in the wrong. As the officers began collecting statements from the patrons, Mac stepped outside. The cool evening air hit his face as he stood on the diner's steps, replaying the confrontation in his mind. Derek's parting words echoed ominously. "We know where to find you." This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mac adjusted his Marine Corps cap and squared his shoulders. If the town wasn't willing to stand up to Derek and his gang, then he would. That night, Mac sat in his small living room, the Marine Corps cap resting on the coffee table. The faint glow of his laptop lit the dim space as he began researching. If Derek and his crew thought they could intimidate him into leaving, they had underestimated the discipline of a Marine who had faced far greater adversaries. It didn't take long for Mac to uncover a pattern. Local news reports hinted at vague allegations of harassment, vandalism, and violence, all attributed to Derek and his friends. The details were sparse, and most of the victims' names were omitted. Those who had spoken out seemed to recant their statements or leave town shortly after. The pieces began to fall into place. Derek and his gang weren't just bullies. They were part of a system of intimidation. Their targets were carefully chosen: outsiders, minorities, and anyone who didn't conform to the town's narrow expectations. The next morning, Mac headed to the community center, where he had recently started working as a fitness coach. Between sessions, he struck up conversations with the staff, gradually steering the topics toward the town and its dynamics. One staff member, a middle-aged receptionist named Sandra, was particularly forthcoming. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she glanced around to ensure no one was listening. "You're not the first," she said, shaking her head. "They've been doing this for years, threatening people, vandalizing property, whatever it takes to make folks like us uncomfortable." Mac leaned closer, his expression serious. "Why hasn't anyone stopped them?" Sandra sighed. "People are scared. Derek's uncle is on the town council, and his dad owns half the businesses around here. And the police, She hesitated. They looked the other way. Her words confirmed what Mac had suspected. The town's system wasn't broken. It was rigged. Derek and his gang operated with impunity because those in power allowed it. "Do you know anyone they've targeted recently?" Mac asked, his voice steady but edged with determination. Sandra nodded slowly. "There was a family, black couple with a teenage son. They moved here last year. Derek and his crew trashed their house, vandalized their car, even left threats on their doorstep. They didn't last long. Packed up and left within a month." Mac's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of Sandra's words settling in his chest. This wasn't just about him. Derek's actions weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a long history of fear and intimidation. As Mac left the community center, his resolve hardened. If no one else was willing to confront Derek and the system that enabled him, Mac would. This wasn't just a fight for his place in the town. It was a stand against everything Derek represented. He wasn't going anywhere. And one way or another, this was going to end. "Lived here for just a short time," Mac continued, his commanding voice steady yet resolute. "But in that time, I've seen enough to know this town has a serious problem. A problem you've all allowed to fester." The room fell silent, all eyes now fixed on Mac. Members of the council shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to thinly veiled defensiveness. Mac held their gaze as he spoke. "Derek and his gang have been terrorizing this town for years. They've harassed families, vandalized businesses, and used intimidation to drive people out, people who had every right to live and thrive here. And from what I've gathered, this isn't just about a few bad apples. This is about a system that protects them, excuses them, and turns a blind eye to their crimes." A murmur rippled through the room, but no one interrupted him. "I've spoken to their victims," Max said, his tone growing firmer. "People who've been forced to leave their homes, shut down their businesses, or live in fear because of what these men have done. And every single one of them told me the same thing. Their complaints went ignored. Why? Because Derek's family has power here. Power that's been used to shield him from the consequences of his actions." Councilman Gerald Haynes, an older man with graying hair and a stiff demeanor, cleared his throat, attempting to assert control. "Mr. Davis, these are serious allegations. Do you have proof to back them up?" Mac reached into his bag and pulled out a thick folder, placing it on the table in front of the council. "Everything you need is right here. Statements, photographs, and records. It's all documented." Haynes hesitated, eyeing the folder as if it might bite him. He exchanged a glance with another council member who appeared equally uneasy. "I'm not here to ask for your permission to act," Mac continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm here to make it clear that I'm not going anywhere. This town deserves better than to live under the thumb of a few bullies and their enablers. And if you won't do something about it, I will." A sharp intake of breath came from somewhere in the crowd, followed by scattered whispers. "Mr. Davis," another council member, a woman in her late 40s with a pinched expression, spoke up. "We understand your concerns, but these matters require proper investigation. You can't expect us to act on hearsay." Mac's gaze locked onto hers, and the weight of his presence silenced the murmurs in the room. "I don't expect you to act on hearsay. That's why I brought evidence. But make no mistake, whether you act or not, change is coming. I won't let this slide. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. The people you've failed to protect are ready to speak up, and they're watching what you do next." For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, the council members visibly grappling with how to respond. Finally, Haynes nodded stiffly. "We'll review the evidence you've provided, Mr. Davis, and we'll discuss this matter further in the coming days." "Make sure you do," Mac said, his tone a clear challenge. As Mac turned to leave, a ripple of quiet applause broke out from the back of the room. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell Mac that his words had struck a chord. People were listening. Over the following days, Mac's efforts intensified. With the information Evan had shared and the evidence he'd compiled, he began rallying the community. He reached out to local activists, contacted state authorities, and even connected with reporters willing to expose the corruption and intimidation that had gripped the town for years. Word spread quickly. Stories that had been buried for years began to resurface, each one further exposing the rot beneath the town's surface. Derek's gang, once untouchable, found themselves under scrutiny like never before. The turning point came when Mac organized a community meeting. Held at the local church, the gathering brought together people from all walks of life, those who had suffered in silence, and those who had watched from the sidelines, too afraid to act. Mac stood at the front of the room, his presence commanding yet approachable. "This isn't just about me," he began. "It's about all of us. For too long, this town has been ruled by fear. But fear only works if we let it. Together, we can take that power back." One by one, people began to speak. A shop owner shared how Derek's gang had vandalized his store. A young woman recounted how her family had been driven out of town after their home was repeatedly targeted. Even Sandra, the receptionist, stood up, her voice trembling but resolute as she detailed years of harassment she'd endured. By the end of the meeting, the room was filled with a sense of shared purpose. What had once been a fragmented community, silenced by fear, was beginning to come together. Meanwhile, Derek and his crew were unraveling. The pressure of public exposure and the growing resistance from the community left them increasingly isolated. Even Derek's father, long shielded by his wealth and influence, found himself facing questions he couldn't easily deflect. But Mac knew the fight wasn't over. Bullies like Derek didn't back down easily. They would lash out, desperate to cling to the control they were losing. And Mac would be ready. The air was thick with tension, the sound of footsteps echoing as Derek, Jake, and Evan advanced under the harsh glow of headlights. Shadows twisted and stretched along the quiet street, mirroring the chaos brewing in the confrontation. Mac stood firm, his broad frame illuminated in stark contrast to the darkness around him. His expression was calm, his eyes unyielding, even as Derek stormed toward him, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can embarrass us and just walk away?" Derek snarled, his voice dripping with venom. He jabbed a finger at Mac's chest, his rage boiling over. "This is our town, and you're about to find out what that means." Mac's gaze swept over the three men. Derek radiated fury, his clenched fists trembling with barely contained rage. Jake was no better, his impatience manifesting in sharp, jerky movements. But Evan lagged behind, his steps hesitant, and his hands fidgeting at his sides. His fear was evident, a stark contrast to the bravado of his companions. "You don't have to do this," Mac said, directing his words to Evan. His voice was steady, carrying a weight that cut through the charged atmosphere. "Walk away now, and you won't regret it." For a moment, Evan faltered, his lips parting as if to respond. But Derek spun on him, his glare sharp and unforgiving. "Don't listen to him," Derek barked. "He's bluffing." "He's nothing." Jake lunged first, his boots pounding against the pavement as he closed the distance. His punch came wide and fast, aimed directly at Mac's jaw, but Mac was ready. Years of discipline and training took over as he sidestepped the blow, his hand snapping out to catch Jake's wrist. With a sharp twist, Mac forced Jake off balance, sending him sprawling to the ground with a pained cry. Derek didn't wait. He charged low, attempting to tackle Mac, but his desperation betrayed him. Mac planted his feet, bracing against the impact. He caught Derek by the shoulders, driving a knee into his stomach with precision. Derek gasped, the air forced from his lungs as he staggered backward, clutching his abdomen. "You're out of your depth," Mac said, his voice calm but firm. He stepped back, his stance unshaken. "Don't make this worse for yourselves." Jake scrambled to his feet, cradling his wrist as he glared at Mac. "You think you're tough because you got lucky?" He spat, his voice laced with spite. "We'll see how tough you are when we're done with you." Evan took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between Mac and Derek. "Maybe we should just leave," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Derek snapped, his anger now directed at Evan. Straightening despite the pain, Derek's glare burned into his reluctant accomplice. "You're not chickening out now. Get in there." Evan hesitated, his trembling hands betraying his internal conflict. He took a shaky step forward, but his eyes met Mac's for a fleeting moment. Mac saw the doubt etched across Evan's face, the conflict warring within him. "You don't want this," Mac said again, his tone softer but resolute. "Walk away. It's not too late." Derek growled in frustration and shoved Evan forward, but Evan froze, his body refusing to obey. The moment of hesitation gave Jake an opening, and he surged toward Mac once more. This time, his attack was more coordinated, his fists aimed low to bypass Mac's guard. Mac shifted, blocking Jake's punches with calculated movements. But Jake's momentum drove them closer to the side of the truck. Mac countered with a sharp elbow to Jake's ribs, forcing a grunt of pain as Jake recoiled. Before Jake could recover, Mac grabbed him by the shirt and slammed him into the truck's side. The metal groaned under the impact as Jake slumped, wheezing and disoriented. Derek's frustration boiled over. Letting out a guttural growl, he charged again, his fists swinging wildly in blind anger. Mac ducked under the first swing and stepped to the side, his movements fluid and controlled. Derek spun, his balance faltering, and Mac took advantage of the opening. A well-placed palm strike to Derek's chest sent him stumbling backward, his arms flailing as he tried to regain his footing. He tripped over the curb, landing hard on the pavement with a thud. Mac turned his attention to Evan, who had remained frozen, his wide eyes locked on the unfolding chaos. "It's over," Mac said firmly. "Walk away. Now." Evan's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he processed the scene before him. Finally, he nodded, his steps unsteady as he backed away. "You coward!" Derek shouted, his voice raw with fury as he struggled to get up. "Get back here!" But Evan didn't look back. He broke into a run, disappearing into the shadows of the street. Mac turned back to Derek, who was now on his feet, his face red with humiliation and rage. Jake was still leaning against the truck, his breaths labored. "You've already lost," Mac said, his voice steady and commanding. "Don't make it worse." Derek glared at him, his chest heaving, but the fight had drained from his posture. With a final look of defiance, he spat on the ground and motioned for Jake to follow. "This isn't over," Derek hissed, his voice trembling with rage as he limped away. Mac stood in silence, watching them retreat into the night. The quiet returned to the street, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mac's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was unshaken. As he turned toward his truck, Mac adjusted his Marine Corps cap, his jaw tightening. He knew Derek's words weren't empty. The fight wasn't over. Not yet, but he'd be ready. Mac sidestepped Derek's wild swing, catching his arm mid-strike with a firm grip. Using Derek's own momentum, Mac twisted his arm and drove him face first into the side of the truck. The metallic clang of the impact echoed down the street as Derek let out a pained shout, struggling against Mac's unyielding hold. Mac leaned in, his voice a low growl that cut through the night air like a blade. "Enough," Mac said, his tone cold and sharp. "You've already lost. Stop before this gets worse." But Derek wasn't ready to concede. With a sudden burst of energy, he shoved backward, breaking free of Mac's hold and spinning around to face him. His face was flushed with fury, his eyes wild. "You think this is over?" Derek spat, his voice shaking with both rage and desperation. "We'll show you what happens when you mess with us." A few feet away, Evan stood frozen, his hands half raised in an indecisive gesture. "Guys, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Evan," Derek barked, turning his glare on his youngest accomplice. "If you're too scared, then stay out of the way." Jake groaned as he pushed himself off the truck, clutching his side. "We're not done yet," he muttered, his voice low but defiant. For a moment, the fight paused. The street fell eerily silent, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Mac stood in the center, his breathing steady, his eyes calmly scanning their movements. He could see Derek's pride clashing with his survival instincts, his fists clenched tightly as he debated his next move. "This is your last chance," Mac said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Walk away." Derek wiped the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand, his lips curling into a snarl. "Not a chance," he hissed, and with that, the fight reignited. Derek charged forward with renewed desperation, his movements reckless but fueled by fury. Jake flanked him, still clutching his ribs but forcing himself upright. Their combined rush forced Mac to shift quickly, his body moving with the precision of someone who'd faced far worse. Derek swung first, a wild right hook aimed at Mac's head. Mac ducked low, pivoting on his foot as he stepped inside Derek's reach. With a sharp, controlled strike to Derek's chest, Mac sent him reeling backward, gasping for air. The blow wasn't meant to injure. It was calculated, a clear reminder of who they were dealing with. Jake seized the opportunity, rushing in from the side. This time, his movements were more deliberate, aiming a driving punch toward Mac's gut. But Mac anticipated the attack, sidestepping effortlessly and catching Jake's wrist mid-swing. With a powerful twist, Mac forced Jake to his knees, eliciting a pained grunt. "You're too predictable," Mac said, his voice calm yet cutting. Jake squirmed, trying to pull free, but Mac shoved him away with a calculated push. Jake tumbled into a parked car, the impact rattling the vehicle. He slumped to the ground, groaning, his earlier bravado completely drained. Derek had recovered just enough to spot a metal pipe lying near the truck. Gripping it tightly, his knuckles white with rage, he swung it wildly at Mac. The first strike whistled past Mac's head, narrowly missing. The second came low, but Mac sidestepped again, his movements fluid and precise. On the third swing, Mac stepped in, closing the gap between them. He grabbed the pipe with one hand, yanking it free from Derek's grip in a single, decisive motion. The force sent Derek stumbling forward, off balance. Mac spun the pipe once in his hand before tossing it aside, with a loud clang that echoed down the street. "You'll need more than a weapon to take me down," Mac said, his tone unwavering, and even then, it wouldn't be enough. Derek's face twisted with rage, but his fear was unmistakable now, flickering behind his eyes like a shadow. He lunged again, his fists swinging wildly, but his movements were sloppy and uncoordinated. Mac blocked each strike with ease, his forearms absorbing the blows without effort. Then, with a calculated uppercut, Mac sent Derek sprawling to the ground. Derek lay there for a moment, clutching his jaw, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. His earlier confidence had shattered entirely. "You done?" Mac asked, his voice steady, almost casual. Before Derek could respond, Jake staggered to his feet, driven by battered pride more than capability. He charged again, his steps sluggish but determined. Mac met him mid-charge, planting a firm hand on Jake's chest and shoving him backward. Jake stumbled, tripping over the curb and landing flat on his back with a groan. Evan stood frozen near the truck, his hands hovering indecisively. His eyes darted between his two fallen companions and Mac, the fear on his face palpable. "Evan," Mac said, his voice softer now, though it still carried an undeniable authority. "You don't have to be a part of this. Walk away." Evan's hands trembled as he swallowed hard, his lips quivering. I don't want this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Then leave," Mac said firmly. "Now." Evan hesitated for only a moment longer before nodding. He took a shaky step back, then another, before turning and jogging away into the night. "Coward!" Derek shouted after him, his voice hoarse and broken. "You're dead, Evan! You hear me?" Mac turned his attention back to Derek, crouching down so their eyes met. His large frame loomed over the gang leader, his voice cold and deliberate. "You've been beaten," Mac said. "Take the loss. Walk away. Don't make this worse." Derek's glare burned with humiliation, but his body was too battered to fight anymore. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, wincing with each movement. He glanced at Jake, still sprawled on the curb, and cursed under his breath. "You'll regret this," Derek said, his voice trembling with venom. "We know where you live. This isn't over." Max straightened, his expression unchanging. "Try it," he said evenly, his tone leaving no room for doubt, "and you'll see just how over it is." Derek grabbed Jake's arm, hauling him upright. Together, they limped away down the street, their voices low as they muttered curses and empty threats. Mac stood in silence, watching them disappear into the darkness. His chest rose and fell steadily, his calm demeanor masking the storm of adrenaline coursing through him. Adjusting his Marine Corps cap, Mac turned back toward his truck, ready for whatever came next. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The adrenaline coursing through Mac's veins had long since subsided, but his resolve remained steady. He didn't let his guard down until the street fell silent once more. The fight was over, but Derek's threats lingered in the air, a promise of trouble yet to come. As Mac turned toward his house, his thoughts began to shift. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about ensuring no one else in this town would have to endure what he'd faced tonight. Later, in the quiet of his living room, Mac sipped a cup of coffee as the events replayed in his mind. The wild swings, the venom in Derek's voice, and, most importantly, Evan's hesitation. Unlike Derek and Jake, Evan had shown signs of doubt. His retreat had spoken volumes. He wasn't fully committed to their cause. He was scared, not of Mac, but of Derek. Mac leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. If Derek and his gang were to be dismantled, brute force alone wouldn't be enough. Fear had kept the town silent for too long. Mac needed someone on the inside, someone who could expose the rot from within. And he knew exactly who that someone was. The next morning, Mac parked his truck near the auto parts store where Evan worked. He waited patiently, his instincts honed by years of discipline. He watched the building, taking in every detail until Evan finally emerged, his shoulders hunched and his eyes darting nervously around the lot. "Evan!" Mac called, his voice calm but firm. Evan froze mid-step, his head snapping toward Mac. His wide eyes betrayed his nerves as Mac approached with deliberate, measured steps, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. "I'm not here to hurt you," Mac said, stopping a few feet away. "I just want to talk." Evan hesitated, his gaze flicking toward his car, as though calculating the possibility of escape. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know what I want," Mac replied, his tone steady. "The truth about Derek, about everything he's done. And I think you want to give it." Evan laughed nervously, shaking his head. "You don't get it. Derek will kill me if I talk." Mac's expression didn't waver. "And what happens if you don't? Do you think he'll protect you when this all falls apart? Or do you think he'll use you as a scapegoat?" Evan flinched, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice cracking. "He's connected. His dad, his uncle, they own this town. They don't own me," Mac said firmly, stepping closer. "And they don't own you either. You have a chance to do the right thing, to walk away from this." Evan's gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Mac's words. "You don't understand," he muttered. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't have a choice." "You do now," Mac said, his voice softer but still edged with determination. "You've seen what Derek has done to this town, to the families he's driven out. Do you really want to be part of that, or do you want to fix it?" Evan swallowed hard, his gaze flicking up to meet Mac's. "What are you asking me to do?" "Tell the truth," Mac said. "Confess to everything. Work with me to bring him down." For a long moment, Evan was silent, his body trembling as he wrestled with the weight of the decision. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "But if I do this, you have to promise me he won't come after me." "You have my word," Mac said, his tone resolute. "You're doing the right thing." That evening, Evan sat at Mac's dining table, his hands gripping a coffee cup as though it were the only thing anchoring him. Mac sat across from him, a recorder placed between them. "Just start from the beginning," Mac said. "What Derek's done, who's been involved, everything." Evan took a deep breath, his words slow at first. But once he started, they poured out like a dam breaking. He described how Derek and Jake had recruited him, using both intimidation and promises of protection. He detailed the vandalism, the threats, and the families they had driven out. He explained how Derek's father and uncle had used their influence to silence complaints and quash investigations, ensuring their crimes never saw the light of day. Mac listened intently, his jaw tightening with each new revelation. This wasn't just a gang of thugs. It was an entire network of corruption, woven into the fabric of the town. When Evan finally finished, he looked exhausted, his shoulders sagging as though a great weight had been lifted. "What now?" he asked quietly. "Now," Mac said, "we take this to the right people. The press, The authorities, anyone who will listen, and we make sure they can't ignore it. Evan nodded, his expression conflicted, but resolute. Okay, he said. Just promise me you'll keep me out of this as much as you can. I'll do my best, Max said, but you need to be ready. Derek's not going to go down quietly. Evan swallowed hard, but he nodded again. I'm in. That night, Mac reviewed the recording, his mind racing with the possibilities. Evan's confession was damning, a treasure trove of information that could dismantle Derek's operation piece by piece. But Mac knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and the hardest part was still ahead. As he shut off the recorder and leaned back in his chair, a faint smile crossed Mac's face. For the first time since he'd arrived in town, it felt like the tide was starting to turn. The next morning, sunlight streamed into Mac's living room as he prepared for the next phase of his plan. Evan's confession wasn't just evidence. It was a roadmap detailing Derek's operation and the web of fear and corruption that kept it running. But a confession alone wasn't enough. Mac needed the town to turn against Derek, to see him for what he truly was. And to do that, he would need to make his next move carefully. The battle for the soul of the town had just begun. Mac stood firm, his imposing figure silhouetted against the dim light of the police staging area. The night was tense, the air thick with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. Detective Collins adjusted his radio, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the rundown garage that served as Derek's base of operations. You didn't have to come, Collins said, his voice low but steady. I'm not here to interfere, Mac replied, his tone calm but resolute. But I've been in this fight long enough to see it through. I want to make sure it ends tonight. Collins gave a curt nod, his expression softening just slightly. Fair enough. Stay back and let us do our job. Mac stepped aside, positioning himself behind a nearby car that gave him a clear view of the operation. The officers moved with precision, a mix of uniformed personnel and plainclothes detectives. Flashlights sliced through the darkness as they crept toward the garage, their weapons drawn and ready. Inside the garage, Derek and his crew were oblivious to the impending raid. Derek paced back and forth, barking orders to Jake and a few other lackeys as they worked on a car. The atmosphere inside was tense, but not with fear, with arrogance. They believed they were untouchable. Collins raised a hand, signaling his team to move in. The officers advanced swiftly, their coordinated movements honed by experience. One officer positioned himself near the side entrance, while another team prepared to breach the front door. A loud knock echoed through the night, breaking the quiet. Police! Open up! The garage fell silent. Derek froze mid-step, his eyes darting toward the door. Jake dropped his wrench, his face paling as the realization hit. What the hell is this? Derek growled, his bravado faltering. The knock came again, louder this time. This is the police. Open the door, or we're coming in. Don't open it, Derek barked, his voice laced with panic. Nobody moves! But it was too late. With a loud crash, the front door was breached, officers flooding into the garage with weapons drawn. Hands in the air! Now! One officer shouted, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. Jake raised his hands immediately, his fear overriding any loyalty to Derek. A few others followed suit, their defiance crumbling under the weight of the armed officers bearing down on them. Derek, however, wasn't ready to give up. You think you can just come in here and take me? He spat, his hands clenched into fists. You've got nothing. Collins stepped forward, his presence commanding. We've got plenty, Derek. Vandalism, threats, intimidation. And thanks to your boy Evan, we've got enough to take down this entire operation. It's over. Derek's face twisted with fury, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none. You'll regret this, Derek hissed, his voice low and venomous. Collins didn't flinch. Save it for your lawyer. Cuff him. Two officers moved in, grabbing Derek's arms and forcing them behind his back. He struggled briefly, but was no match for their restraint. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the garage, a final punctuation to the end of Derek's reign. Outside, Mac watched as the officers escorted Derek, Jake, and the rest of the crew to waiting squad cars. Derek's glare burned into Mac as he was led past, his pride shattered but his hatred still simmering beneath the surface. This isn't over, Derek shouted, his voice filled with desperation. Mac stepped forward, his gaze steady as he met Derek's eyes. "Yes, it is," he said simply, his tone carrying the weight of certainty. As the cars pulled away, the quiet of the night returned. Collins approached Mac, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You were right," he said. "This needed to happen." Mac nodded, his jaw tightening. "It's a start." The following morning, the town was abuzz with the news of Derek's arrest. Eric Martin's article hit the front page of the regional paper, detailing the takedown and the web of corruption that had been exposed. The headlines were impossible to ignore. Small-town justice, the fall of Derek Hastings, and his network of fear. Businesses reopened with a newfound sense of safety, and residents who had lived in fear for years began speaking out. The tide had turned, and the town was finally beginning to heal. Mac stood on his porch, watching as neighbors greeted each other with tentative smiles. For the first time, the weight of Derek's oppression had lifted. Collins's voice echoed in Mac's mind. "You were right. This needed to happen." But Mac knew the fight wasn't over. Corruption wasn't uprooted in a single night, and there were still battles to be fought. Yet, as he sipped his coffee and watched the morning sun rise over the town, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This was the beginning of something new, a chance for the town to rebuild, stronger and freer than it had been in years, and Mac would be there, ready to stand his ground if needed. The early morning sunlight glinted off Mac's truck as he leaned against its hood, arms folded across his chest, watching the community begin to stir. Conversations buzzed around him like a swarm of restless bees, their urgency palpable. The arrests of Derek and his crew the previous night had sent shockwaves through the town, and now the community was grappling with what came next. "You hear about Derek?" one man whispered as he passed Mac, his voice low but unmistakably triumphant. "They got him, Jake, and the others last night." "About time," replied another. "But you know his dad's not gonna let this slide." Mac's jaw tightened. He wasn't naive. Derek's family still held significant sway in the town. They wouldn't accept defeat without a fight. But, for the first time, the arrests had given the town something it hadn't felt in years: hope. The gang's aura of invincibility had been shattered, and the community was beginning to believe that justice was possible. At the police station, Detective Collins was already knee-deep in the fallout. His desk was swamped with phone calls, each one more aggressive than the last. Derek's father's legal team was relentless, using every tactic to intimidate and stall the investigation. Collins barely looked up as Mac entered the room. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest," Collins muttered, gesturing for Mac to sit. "Good," Mac replied, lowering himself into the chair. "The more noise they make, the guiltier they look." Collins allowed himself a faint smirk before his expression turned serious. "The DA's on board, but we're going to need more to make this stick. Derek's dad is throwing everything he's got at this, and the pressure's coming down hard." "You've got the confession," Mac said, his tone resolute. "You've got the evidence and witnesses coming forward. What else do you need?" "Support," Collins admitted, leaning back in his chair. "Public opinion matters in cases like this. If the town backs us, it'll be harder for them to wriggle out of it." Mac leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Then you'll get it. People are tired of being afraid." By midday, the town square was alive with activity. Mac stood near the steps of the community center, watching as a crowd began to gather. The arrests had emboldened the town, and stories of Derek's reign of terror were surfacing with greater frequency. People who had once been too scared to speak out were finding their voices. Eric Martin, the young journalist whose article had lit the first spark, stood nearby, jotting notes into his well-worn notebook. His presence was a reminder that the eyes of the outside world were now on this small town. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her weathered face etched with determination. She held a microphone with trembling hands, but spoke with unwavering resolve. "For years, my family and I lived in fear," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "Derek and his gang vandalized our home, threatened my husband, and made us feel like prisoners in our own town. We tried to report it, but nothing ever came of it. We were told to keep quiet, to avoid making waves," the crowd murmured, their anger building as her story struck a chord. "But no more," she continued, her voice rising with newfound strength. "Thanks to Mac and the officers who finally took a stand, we have a chance to take our town back, and I'm not going to be silent anymore." The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the square shifting from fear to defiance. One by one, others came forward, business owners, parents, and neighbors, all sharing their stories of intimidation and injustice. The weight of their collective voices was impossible to ignore. Max stood at the edge of the gathering, his arms crossed as he listened. For the first time, he saw the beginnings of a united community, one no longer willing to cower in the face of Derek's intimidation. At the community center steps, Eric Martin caught Mac's attention, motioning for him to step aside. "Mac," Eric said, his voice urgent but optimistic, "this is big. The town's rallying behind you. We're running a follow-up story tomorrow, and it's going to blow this wide open." "Good," Mac replied. "The more people see what's happening here, the harder it'll be for Derek's family to cover it up." Eric nodded. "The DA's team is pushing for indictments, but they're going to need more than just public opinion. They'll need your testimony too." Mac's gaze hardened, his resolve unshaken. "Then they'll have it." That evening, Mac returned to his porch, the warm glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen. A message from Detective Collins. "Warrant signed. We're moving in on Derek's father's assets tomorrow. Be ready if we need you." Mac read the message twice, the weight of its significance sinking in. This was the next step, the phase that could dismantle the system that had enabled Derek and his crew for so long. As he leaned back in his chair, Mac allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. The town was no longer silent, and neither was he. Tomorrow would be another battle, but Mac was ready. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dispersing crowd as Mac listened to Robert Hastings's words echo in his mind. The spin was blatant, calculated to play on loyalty and fear. Hastings was a master manipulator, turning years of influence into a weapon to protect his family. But for every nod of agreement in the crowd, Mac noticed something else: hesitation, doubt, and even defiance flickering in the eyes of others. The tide was shifting, and Hastings knew it. Eric Martin caught up to Mac, his notepad tucked under his arm. His face was tense, his eyes scanning the remaining onlookers. "They're rattled," Eric said, his voice low. Some of the council members looked ready to bolt the moment he started talking. "They should be," Mac replied, his tone steely. "But Hastings isn't just spinning a narrative. He's sending a message. This isn't over." Eric nodded grimly, glancing around before stepping closer. "There's more. I've been digging into the council's records. Hastings's uncle has been funneling town funds into a shell company. It's tied directly to Derek's so-called fundraisers. It's dirty, Mac. Real dirty." Mac's jaw tightened. "That's the kind of leverage they've been using to keep everyone quiet. Can you prove it?" Eric tapped his notepad. "I've got enough to raise questions, but I'll need more to make it airtight. If we expose this, it could break their entire operation." "Then we expose it," Mac said, his voice firm. "No more half measures. They're counting on people being too scared or too beaten down to push back. Let's show them they're wrong." The next morning, the town was abuzz with renewed tension. Robert Hastings's press conference had been the talk of every diner and street corner. Opinions were divided, but the cracks in his family's facade were beginning to show. Mac spent the day moving between allies, quietly rallying support and gathering testimonies. At the community center, he met with Sandra, the receptionist who had first warned him about Derek's reign of terror. Her resolve had only strengthened since the arrests. "I've been keeping notes," she said, sliding a folder across the table. "Dates, times, everything I've seen over the years. I don't know if it's enough, but it's something." "It's more than enough," Mac assured her. "Every piece helps. Thank you." As he left the center, his phone buzzed. It was Eric. "I've got something," the journalist said, his voice tight with urgency. "Meet me at the diner in 10. At the diner, Eric sat in a corner booth, his laptop open and his notepad filled with hastily scribbled notes. He barely looked up as Mac slid into the seat across from him. "What is it?" Mac asked, his tone direct. "Hastings's uncle," Eric began, turning the laptop to face Mac. "I dug deeper into the shell company. It's tied to a property out by the old mill. That's where they've been laundering the money and storing other things." "Other things?" Mac pressed. Eric hesitated. "There's evidence suggesting it's more than just cash. Documents, records, maybe even leverage they've used to keep people in line. If we can get our hands on that, it's game over for the Hastings family." Mac's eyes narrowed. "Does Collins know?" "Not yet," Eric admitted. "I wanted to run it by you first. If we tell him, they'll need a warrant to go in. That takes time, and Hastings might move everything before then." Mac considered the risks, his mind racing. "We don't have time for delays. If we're going to act, it has to be now." That evening, Mac and Eric drove out to the property near the old mill. The dilapidated building stood against the backdrop of the setting sun, its windows dark and foreboding. Eric parked a distance away, the two men stepping out cautiously. "You sure about this?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not even a little," Mac replied, his tone grim. "But if we're going to bring them down, we need to know what they're hiding." The air was heavy with tension as they approached the building. Mac moved ahead, his steps silent and deliberate. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the interior dimly lit by streaks of moonlight filtering through broken windows. Stacks of boxes lined the walls, and the faint smell of mildew permeated the air. Eric fumbled with a flashlight, the beam illuminating a desk cluttered with papers. Mac scanned the room, his sharp eyes picking up on a locked cabinet in the corner. "Over there," he said, nodding toward it. Eric followed, his hands shaking slightly as he rifled through the desk drawers, eventually finding a small key. The lock clicked open, revealing folders, ledgers, and a flash drive. "This is it," Eric whispered, his excitement palpable. Mac quickly flipped through the files, his expression darkening. Bank statements, property deals, payoffs. They've been buying silence for years. This is what we need. A noise from outside froze them both in place. Footsteps. Mac motioned for Eric to stay quiet, his body tensing as he moved toward the door. Peering through the crack, he saw the silhouette of a man near a truck parked by the mill. "Hastings sent someone to clean up," Mac whispered, his voice low. "What do we do?" Eric asked, his voice barely audible. Mac's expression hardened. "We stick to the plan. Get this evidence out of here. I'll handle him." Eric hesitated but nodded, quickly gathering the documents and stuffing them into his bag. Mac stepped outside, his presence immediate as the man near the truck turned, startled. "You lost?" Mac asked, his tone casual but sharp. The man's hand moved toward his waistband, but Mac was faster. He closed the distance in seconds, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The weapon clattered to the ground as the man yelped in pain. "You tell Hastings," Mac growled, his voice low and menacing. "We're done playing his game. The truth is coming out, and there's nothing he can do to stop it." The man nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet and fleeing into the night. Mac watched him go before turning back to the mill. Eric emerged moments later, his bag slung over his shoulder. "Got it all," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "Good," Mac replied, leading the way back to the car. "Let's make sure the whole town sees what's been hiding in the shadows." As they drove back, the weight of what they'd uncovered began to sink in. This wasn't just evidence. It was the key to dismantling everything the Hastings family had built, and Mac wasn't about to stop until the fight was won. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, every creak of the benches and rustle of paper magnified in the heavy silence. Mac sat in the back, his unwavering presence a quiet reminder of the town's collective determination. He watched as the Hastings family, once untouchable, began to unravel under the weight of their own corruption. At the stand, Evan continued his testimony, his voice steadying with each word. "The payments weren't accidents," he said, his eyes darting briefly toward Derek and Robert Hastings. "They were deliberate. We knew the money was being funneled through shell accounts, tied to fake town projects. It was how they kept control, how they silenced anyone who might push back." The prosecutor, Valerie Knight, nodded encouragingly. "And who orchestrated these payments?" Evan glanced at Robert Hastings again, the older man's glare sharp enough to cut. But Mac's steady gaze from the gallery gave Evan the strength to continue. "Derek's uncle handled most of it," Evan said, "but it all came from the top. Robert Hastings knew. He approved everything." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom, the weight of Evan's words crashing down on the assembled spectators. The judge's gavel restored order, but the damage had been done. As the trial progressed, Valerie meticulously dismantled the Hastings defense. Eric's investigative work was presented. The paper trail he had uncovered laid bare for all to see. Bank statements, forged invoices, and financial records tied directly to Robert Hastings and his brother were projected onto the courtroom screen. Each document was a nail in the coffin of the Hastings family's empire. The defense attorney, smooth and polished, did his best to deflect. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Derek was a misguided young man caught in a web of misunderstandings. But Valerie was relentless. "Misunderstandings don't create secret accounts or fake town projects," she countered. "Misunderstandings don't terrorize families or drive people out of their homes. This was a deliberate, calculated operation designed to consolidate power and protect those who abused it." Mac watched as the town's collective voice grew louder with each testimony and each piece of evidence. Business owners, residents, and former employees of the Hastings family took the stand, each adding another layer to the case. One witness, a former accountant for the Hastings construction firm, revealed discrepancies in the company's books. "I noticed irregularities for years," she admitted, "but every time I brought them up, I was told to keep quiet. Or else." Another witness, a shop owner who had been targeted by Derek's crew, spoke with raw emotion. "I almost lost everything," he said, his voice breaking. "They destroyed my storefront, threatened my family, and every time I tried to report it, nothing happened. The Hastings family owned the town, and we were all too scared to fight back." As the trial neared its conclusion, the defense's strategy began to crumble. Robert Hastings was called to testify. His usual commanding presence diminished under the prosecutor's withering cross-examination. "Mr. Hastings," Valerie began, her voice steady and cutting, "are you aware of the allegations that money from your company was used to fund illegal activities tied to your son?" "I have no knowledge of any such activities," Robert replied, his voice measured but strained. Valerie's expression didn't waver. "So, you're claiming ignorance, despite the overwhelming evidence linking these funds directly to accounts under your supervision?" Robert hesitated, his composure faltering for the first time. "Those accounts, they were handled by my brother. I trusted him. And yet, these payments align perfectly with incidents of vandalism, intimidation, and property damage tied to your son's activities," Valerie pressed. "Are you saying this is all a coincidence?" Robert's silence spoke volumes. In her closing argument, Valerie addressed the jury with the same unwavering conviction she had shown throughout the trial. "This case isn't just about Derek Hastings, or even his father," she said, her voice resonating through the courtroom. "It's about a town that has been held hostage by fear and corruption. The evidence is clear. The testimony is undeniable. It's time to take a stand. For the victims, for the community, and for justice." As the jury deliberated, Mac stepped outside the courthouse, the weight of the trial bearing down on him. The town square buzzed with anticipation. Residents gathered in small groups, their whispers carrying equal parts hope and trepidation. Eric approached him, his notepad in hand but untouched. "Think they'll convict?" Mac's eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, each one a testament to the resilience and determination of the town. "They have to," he said simply. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. The foreperson stood, the verdict in hand. "On the charges of corruption, harassment, and conspiracy, we find the defendants guilty." The room erupted. Some cheered, others wept. But the collective weight of years of fear and oppression seemed to lift in that moment. Mac allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. The fight had been long and grueling, but it wasn't over. This was a victory, yes, but it was only the first step toward rebuilding a town that had been broken for far too long. As the Hastings family was led away, their empire in ruins, Mac turned and walked out of the courthouse. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the town square. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter, filled not with fear, but with hope. And Mac knew, as he headed back to his truck, that the town was ready to move forward, together. Mac raised a hand, silencing the reporters clamoring for his attention. His calm, unyielding demeanor commanded the chaos outside the courthouse. "I'll say this," he began, his deep voice cutting through the din. "This trial is a step forward, but it's not the end. The fight against fear, intimidation, and corruption in this town isn't over. Not yet." The crowd buzzed with energy as Mac turned to walk away, his presence unmistakably that of a man who had carried the weight of an entire community on his shoulders. Cameras followed his every move, reporters shouting follow-up questions, but he didn't stop. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was starkly different. The gallery had mostly cleared, leaving behind only a few stragglers and the quiet murmur of courthouse staff. Valerie Knight stood near the prosecutor's table, packing up her files. Detective Collins joined her, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You pulled it off," Collins said, his voice carrying a note of admiration. Valerie shook her head. "We all did. Without Mac, Evan, and everyone who came forward, this wouldn't have happened." Collins crossed his arms, his expression thoughtful. "Still, the Hastings family won't go quietly. Robert's already working on damage control. He'll fight tooth and nail to protect what's left of their empire." Valerie's gaze hardened. "Let him. We're not stopping until every last piece of their corruption is exposed." Mac returned home that evening, the quiet of his modest house a stark contrast to the day's intensity. He sat on his porch, the night air cool against his skin. The sound of crickets filled the silence as he reflected on the trial. Justice had been served, but Mac knew the battle wasn't over. Robert Hastings still held influence, and the system that had enabled Derek's reign wouldn't dismantle itself overnight. But for the first time, Mac felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Eric Martin. "New leads on Hastings's financial dealings. Meeting tomorrow morning. We've got momentum. Let's keep pushing." Mac stared at the message for a moment before typing a quick response. "I'll be there." The next morning, the town buzzed with conversation. The verdict and sentencing dominated every corner, from the diner to the hardware store. People who had once whispered in fear now spoke openly, their voices carrying a newfound confidence. Eric's follow-up article hit the newsstands with the headline, "Justice Served: The Fall of Derek Hastings." The story detailed not only the trial, but the broader implications of the Hastings family's corruption. Eric had included testimonies from victims and a breakdown of the evidence presented, ensuring that the community, and beyond, understood the significance of what had been achieved. At the community center, Mac met with Valerie, Collins, and Eric. They sat around a table, stacks of documents spread before them. "We've got traction," Eric said, his voice tinged with excitement. "People are coming forward with more information: property deals, fraudulent accounts, even connections to the council." Valerie leaned forward, her expression serious. "This is what we need to go after Robert Hastings and his brother. If we can prove their involvement, we'll take down the entire operation." Collins nodded. "It's risky, but if we play this right, we can cut the head off the snake for good." Mac's gaze swept over the table. "Let's make sure we do. This town deserves to be free from their grip." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Investigators pored over financial records, uncovering a tangled web of corruption that stretched far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. The community continued to rally, their voices growing louder with each passing day. Mac remained at the forefront, a steady presence that inspired confidence and resolve. He met with business owners, attended town meetings, and offered support to those still hesitant to come forward. When the announcement came that formal charges were being filed against Robert Hastings and his brother, the town erupted in celebration. It wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. Months later, as Mac stood in the town square, he watched as children played and neighbors greeted one another with smiles. The shadow that had loomed over the town for so long was finally lifting. Eric approached, a grin on his face. "Looks like you've done it, Mac. The town's finally starting to heal." Mac shook his head. "We've all done it. This was never just about me." Eric nodded, his respect evident. "What's next for you?" Mac glanced toward the horizon, the warmth of the sun on his face. "There's always more to do," he said, "but for now, I think this town's in good hands." As the two men stood in the square, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, a testament to the resilience of a community that had reclaimed its voice. And for the first time in years, the future felt bright. Mac stood in the community center, the weight of Sandra's words lingering in the air, the faint hum of conversation from the bulletin board mixed with the rhythmic clinking of weights being lifted in the gym. For weeks, this town had been defined by its fear, its silence. But now, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable, a sense of unity, of resilience that couldn't be ignored. Sandra's smile widened as she watched Mac glance around the room. Notices on the board proclaimed a new era, a community cleanup day, a fundraising fair for local businesses, and even a celebration of resilience events scheduled for the weekend. The bulletin board itself, once bare and ignored, now brimmed with the signs of a town rediscovering itself. "You've done more than you know," Sandra said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that cut through the quiet. Mac didn't respond immediately. He didn't feel like a hero, despite the way people looked at him now. He'd stepped into a fight that needed to happen, but the real work, the rebuilding, was theirs to do. Yet, staying felt right. Not because the fight was over, but because there was still more to build. In the days following the trial, the town's wounds began to show signs of healing. Derek and his crew were behind bars, and the Hastings family's shadow had shrunk under the scrutiny of public and legal pressure. People walked with their heads a little higher, their voices louder in meetings and conversations. At the diner, once hushed whispers had turned into animated discussions about the future. Plans for a revitalized town square, local festivals, and small business expansions were suddenly more than just pipe dreams. Max sat at his usual booth near the window, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He listened to the buzz of voices around him, content to let the town take center stage. That evening, Mac returned to his porch, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The stars above seemed brighter, the weight that had hung over the town lifting with each passing day. He leaned back in his chair, the rhythmic creak a familiar companion as he sipped his coffee. His phone buzzed with a message from Eric Martin. "New leads on the Hastings accounts. This might be the final blow. Let's meet tomorrow." Mac's lips pressed into a thin line. The fight wasn't completely over. Robert Hastings's influence still lingered like a stubborn storm cloud. But as Mac glanced toward the distant glow of the town square, he realized something profound. This wasn't just his fight anymore. The town had found its voice, its people standing together against the forces that had tried to silence them for so long. And while the Hastings family might still wield power, they were no longer untouchable. At the weekend's celebration of resilience, Mac stood near the edge of the crowd, his broad frame blending into the background. Children darted around him, laughing and chasing balloons as their parents mingled, sharing stories of triumph and determination. Sandra spotted him and approached, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "You're really sticking around?" she asked, her tone teasing but her eyes searching. "Yeah," Max said, taking the cup she offered. "Feels like there's more to do." Sandra nodded, her smile soft and knowing. "Good. This town needs people like you, not just for the fights, but for everything after." Mac didn't respond right away, instead letting the sounds of laughter and music wash over him. For so long, this town had been defined by its silence, its submission. Now, it was finding its way back to life, and Mac realized he wasn't just here to fight battles. He was here to see what came after. The celebration stretched into the evening, the glow of string lights casting a warm golden hue over the town square. Mac stayed until the crowd thinned, his usual quiet presence blending seamlessly with the atmosphere of hope and renewal. As he walked home under the starlit sky, Mac knew his decision to stay was the right one. The battle against the Hastings family wasn't over, but for the first time, The town was ready to stand together, and as long as they needed him, Mac would be there. Steady, strong, and unyielding. The fight wasn't just about taking back the town. It was about giving it a future worth fighting for. And that fight was one Mac Davis was ready to see through to the end.